The rusted chain-link fence had been standing for 47 years, wrapped around the entrance to what locals called the Blackwood Mine. Weather-beaten signs warned trespassers to stay away, their faded letters barely legible against corroded metal. The mine shaft opening sat like a dark mouth in the hillside, partially collapsed and completely forgotten by everyone except the county records office and two brothers who had spent months researching abandoned properties across 3 states. Marcus and David Chen had always been drawn to the forgotten places, the locations that time had left behind. Their childhood had been filled with exploration, wandering through condemned buildings and mapping out underground tunnels in their hometown. As adults, that curiosity had transformed into something more calculated, more ambitious. They had built a modest real estate portfolio by purchasing distressed properties, renovating them, and selling them for profit. But the Blackwood Mine represented something entirely different, something that went beyond simple investment strategy. The auction had been sparsely attended, just a handful of curious onlookers and one other serious bidder. The property included 73 acres of mountainous terrain and the sealed mine shaft that had been closed since the mid-1970s after a series of safety violations forced its permanent shutdown. Most potential buyers saw liability and endless complications. The brothers saw possibility wrapped in mystery, a puzzle that had been sealed away for nearly half a century. Their winning bid of $87,000 had raised eyebrows among the few people who knew about the purchase. Friends questioned their judgment, family members expressed concern about the investment, and their business partners wondered if they had finally pushed their risk tolerance too far. But Marcus and David had done their research thoroughly, spending countless hours in local libraries, courthouse basements, and online archives piecing together the history of the Blackwood Mine. If you're watching this and feeling that rush of excitement about what these brothers are about to discover, make sure you hit that subscribe button right now because this story is just getting started. And if you're loving this content and want to support the channel, consider joining our Super Thanks program. Your support helps us bring you more incredible stories like this one. Also, drop a comment below and let us know where you're watching from. Are you Team Adventure or Team Play It Safe? We want to hear from you. The mine had originally opened in 1921, during a time when the region was experiencing a mineral boom that drew prospectors and mining companies from across the country. Initial reports suggested modest deposits of copper and zinc, nothing that would make headlines but enough to justify the investment in equipment and labor. The operation had employed anywhere from 30 to 50 workers during its peak years, running 2 shifts that kept the tunnels active nearly 24 hours a day. But something had changed in the late 1940s. Production records became sporadic, and workforce numbers dropped dramatically. By 1952, the mine was operating with a skeleton crew of just 8 workers, and the output had dwindled to almost nothing. Then, in 1953, the operation shut down completely for reasons that weren't entirely clear from the public records. The property changed hands 3 times over the next 2 decades, with each new owner attempting to restart operations only to abandon the effort within months. The final closure in 1976 came after a state inspection revealed structural instabilities and unsafe working conditions throughout the tunnel system. The order to seal the mine had been absolute, with the entrance filled with concrete and the property posted with permanent warning signs. For 47 years, the Blackwood Mine had sat undisturbed, slowly being reclaimed by the forest that surrounded it, becoming little more than a footnote in the region's mining history. Marcus and David had spent 3 months preparing for their first descent into the mine. They had hired structural engineers to assess the entrance area, brought in geologists to evaluate potential risks, and consulted with experienced miners who had worked in similar operations. The brothers had invested nearly $30,000 in safety equipment, communication devices, air quality monitors, and backup power systems. They weren't treasure hunters operating on hunches and hope. They were methodical businessmen who happened to be chasing a calculated risk. The original concrete seal had partially deteriorated over the decades, with water damage and ground shifts creating cracks in what was supposed to be a permanent barrier. Rather than attempting to break through the old seal, the brothers and their small crew worked carefully to create a new entrance point that would be structurally sound and allow for safe passage. The process took 2 weeks, with each day bringing them closer to whatever waited in the darkness beyond. When the breakthrough finally came on a cold October morning, the first thing that emerged from the opening was a rush of stale air that smelled of mineral dust and decades of isolation. The brothers stood at the entrance, their headlamps cutting through the darkness, revealing timber supports that had somehow remained intact despite the years of abandonment. The main tunnel extended forward into complete blackness, with side passages branching off at regular intervals, creating a maze of corridors that had been mapped decades ago but never fully explored. Their first descent was cautious and methodical, with every step documented by multiple cameras and every air reading carefully recorded. The main tunnel sloped downward at a consistent angle, with the walls showing clear evidence of the mining techniques used in the early 20th century. Tool marks were still visible in the stone, and sections of narrow-gauge railway track remained embedded in the floor, rusted but intact, telling the story of how or had been transported to the surface. 50 feet into the tunnel, they encountered their first significant obstacle. A partial collapse had occurred at some point after the mine's closure, with debris creating a barrier that blocked the main passage. But the brothers had anticipated such challenges, and they had brought equipment designed specifically for clearing obstacles safely. Over the course of 3 days, they carefully removed enough material to create a passageway, reinforcing the area with modern supports to prevent further collapse. Beyond the blockage, the tunnel opened into a larger chamber that had clearly served as a staging area for mining operations. Old equipment lay scattered across the floor, preserved in the dry underground environment like artifacts in a time capsule. Pneumatic drills sat beside their compressed air tanks, hand tools hung from hooks on the walls, and wooden crates filled with supplies remained stacked in corners. The brothers documented everything, photographing each item and noting its condition, aware that they were walking through a perfectly preserved snapshot of industrial history. The mine's layout became clearer as they explored further. The main tunnel continued downward for approximately 300 feet, with numerous side passages that had been excavated to follow promising mineral veins. Most of these side tunnels were relatively short, extending 30 to 50 feet before terminating at rock faces where the deposits had been exhausted or deemed not worth pursuing. But the main shaft continued deeper, heading toward a destination that the original maps suggested was the mine's primary working area. At the 200-foot mark, they discovered evidence that the mine had been more productive than the official records suggested. The walls showed extensive excavation work, with large sections of rock removed to extract what must have been significant mineral deposits. Chemical analysis of the remaining ore showed high concentrations of copper and zinc, along with traces of silver and other valuable elements. The brothers began to understand why the mine had attracted so much interest over the years, and why multiple owners had attempted to restart operations. But they also began to notice something strange. The deeper they went, the more they found evidence of hasty abandonment. Tools lay where they had been dropped, support timbers had been left unfinished, and in one area, a partially loaded ore cart sat on the tracks as if workers had simply walked away mid-shift. The usual signs of an orderly shutdown weren't present. Instead, everything suggested that at some point, people had left quickly and never returned. The main tunnel eventually reached a junction where 3 passages converged. The largest continued straight ahead, descending even more steeply into the earth. The second branched to the left, heading toward what the old maps labeled as the Eastern Expansion. The third, smaller passage headed right, marked on the maps simply as Deep Shaft Access. The brothers chose to continue down the main tunnel first, following the path that would take them to the lowest point of the original mining operation. The descent became more challenging as they progressed. The angle steepened, requiring them to use climbing equipment and rope systems to maintain safety. Water had begun to seep through cracks in the walls, creating small streams that flowed downward into the darkness. Their air quality monitors showed acceptable levels, but the atmosphere felt heavier, more oppressive, as if the weight of the earth above was becoming more palpable with each step downward. At approximately 400 feet below the surface, the tunnel opened into a massive chamber that took their breath away. The space was enormous, easily 100 feet across and at least 50 feet high, with walls that showed the scars of extensive mining activity. But what dominated the chamber wasn't the evidence of past excavation. It was what remained. The walls of the chamber glittered in the light from their lamps, covered in crystalline formations that had grown over decades of isolation. Mineral deposits in shades of green, blue, and purple covered vast sections of the rock face, creating natural artwork that would have been worth photographing for scientific journals alone. But interspersed among these formations were veins of exposed or that showed clear signs of valuable mineral content. This wasn't just a pretty cave, it was potentially a significant mineral deposit that had been left completely untouched. The brothers spent hours in that chamber, taking samples, documenting the formations, and trying to understand why such a resource had been abandoned. Their preliminary analysis suggested that the visible deposits alone could be worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, possibly more depending on the extent and purity of the minerals. But this was just one chamber, and the tunnel system extended even further downward. They returned to the surface that evening exhausted but energized, their minds racing with possibilities. The samples they had collected would need professional analysis, but even their basic field tests suggested they had found something significant. That night, they reviewed their footage and photographs, planning their next descent and discussing how to proceed responsibly and safely. The following week, they returned with additional equipment and a geologist they had brought onto the team as a consultant. Dr. Sarah Matthews had spent 30 years studying mining operations and mineral deposits across North America, and her expertise proved invaluable as they descended once again into the Blackwood mine. She examined the chamber they had discovered, taking her own samples and providing analysis that confirmed their initial impressions. The deposits were substantial, and the mineral quality was higher than the historical records had indicated. But Dr. Matthews also pointed out something the brothers had missed. The geological formations in the chamber suggested that the deposits continued deeper, extending below the floor of the chamber itself. The original miners had stopped their excavation at this level, but the mineralization likely continued downward, potentially for dozens or even hundreds of feet. The question was whether there was any way to access those lower deposits without undertaking a massive new excavation project. The answer came from the old maps, specifically the notation about deep shaft access that they had noticed earlier. When they explored that smaller passage, they discovered that the original miners had indeed attempted to extend their operations deeper. A vertical shaft had been carved into the rock, descending from a side chamber near the 300-foot level. The shaft was narrow, barely wide enough for one person, and it was equipped with the remnants of a rope and pulley system that had been used to lower workers and equipment. The vertical shaft presented both an opportunity and a significant challenge. Modern safety standards would never permit descent without proper equipment and backup systems, but the shaft represented potential access to whatever lay beneath the main chamber. The brothers invested in specialized vertical caving equipment, consulting with experts in underground exploration to ensure they could make the descent safely. Preparation took another 2 weeks. They installed new anchor points, ran safety lines, set up communication systems that could function in the vertical shaft, and created detailed emergency protocols. They also brought in a small camera drone that could be lowered into the shaft ahead of them, providing reconnaissance of what waited below. The drone footage was both encouraging and concerning. The shaft descended approximately 80 feet before opening into another chamber. The drone's lights revealed more crystalline formations, additional evidence of mineral deposits, and something else that caught their attention. There appeared to be man-made structures at the bottom, timber frameworks, and what looked like processing equipment that had been lowered into the deeper chamber during the mine's operational years. Marcus made the first descent, his movements careful and deliberate as he worked his way down the narrow shaft. The walls were smooth, carved with precision that spoke to the skill of the original miners. Every 10 feet, he found remnants of the old safety systems, metal rings, and wooden platforms that had once provided rest points during the climb. The journey down seemed to take hours, though his timer indicated only 12 minutes had passed from start to finish. The lower chamber was different from the one above. Where the main chamber had felt like a natural cave expanded by human activity, this space felt entirely carved by hand. The walls were remarkably smooth, and the ceiling formed a nearly perfect dome that rose 30 feet above the floor. But what dominated the space was the equipment that had been left behind. Several large wooden frames stood in the center of the chamber, their purpose not immediately obvious. Closer inspection revealed they had been used for sorting and initial processing, with screens and channels that would have separated mineral-rich material from waste rock. Next to these frames sat 3 large wooden crates, their exterior surfaces covered in decades of mineral dust but remarkably well preserved in the dry underground environment. The crates were locked, their hardware rusted but still functional. Using careful techniques to avoid damage, Marcus worked on opening the first crate while maintaining video communication with David and Dr. Matthews on the surface. The lock finally gave way, and the lid lifted to reveal contents that had been sealed away for potentially 7 decades. Inside the first crate, wrapped in oiled canvas that had protected them from moisture, were dozens of samples. Each sample was labeled with careful handwriting, noting the date of extraction, the location within the mine, and preliminary assay results. The samples represented months of systematic exploration, with each one chosen to represent different mineral veins and formations throughout the tunnel system. For a geologist, it was a treasure trove of information. For the brothers, it represented proof that the mine had been far more valuable than official records indicated. The second crate contained documents, maps, notebooks, and official paperwork that chronicled the mine's operations in detail that had never made it into public records. The brothers found production logs that showed significantly higher yields than what had been reported to county officials. They found geological surveys that identified multiple promising areas for future excavation. Most importantly, they found personal journals kept by the mine's foreman, documenting day-to-day operations and providing insight into why the mine had been abandoned so suddenly. The journals told a story of increasing pressure from owners who wanted higher production numbers, of corners cut to reduce costs, and of growing concerns about structural stability in the deeper sections. The final entries, dated just weeks before the 1953 shutdown, described accidents, equipment failures, and a decision by the workers themselves to walk away from the operation rather than risk their lives for owners who refused to invest in proper safety measures. The mine hadn't been closed by authorities. It had been abandoned by workers who valued their lives more than their paychecks. But the third crate contained something unexpected. Inside, protected by multiple layers of canvas and waxed paper, were samples that differed from the typical specimens. These were larger, more refined pieces that showed signs of having been processed and concentrated. Analysis would later confirm what became immediately obvious even in the dim light of the underground chamber. These weren't just samples. They were refined mineral concentrates with exceptional purity, representing months of work by miners who had been systematically extracting and processing the highest quality material they could find. The concentrates filled dozens of smaller containers, each carefully sealed and labeled. Copper concentrates in shades of brilliant red and orange, zinc compounds in pure white and pale yellow, and most remarkably, silver that had been refined to an exceptional purity. The combined weight of the concentrates exceeded 200 pounds, and conservative estimates suggested a value in the hundreds of thousands of dollars based solely on current commodity prices. But the discovery raised more questions than it answered. Why had these concentrates been left behind? If the workers had abandoned the mine suddenly, why take the time to carefully pack and seal such valuable material? The answer came from a letter tucked into the third crate, written by someone named Thomas Blackwood, presumably the mine's original owner or operator. The letter, dated March 17, 1953, explained that the concentrates represented insurance. The mine was being shut down not because it wasn't productive, but because the corporate owners had decided they could generate more profit by selling the property and mineral rights than by continuing expensive operations in challenging geological conditions. The workers, who had been promised profit sharing but never received it, had decided to keep their portion of the proceeds. These concentrates represented months of work during off hours, material they had processed themselves using the mine's equipment but from or they had excavated in their spare time. The plan, according to the letter, had been to return for the concentrates once the legal situation with the mine's ownership had been resolved. But complications had arisen. Ownership had changed hands multiple times, and eventually, the mine had been sealed by state order. Thomas Blackwood's letter ended with coordinates and instructions for his heirs, should they ever gain access to the mine again. But apparently, those heirs had never come, or perhaps had never known about the letter, and the concentrates had remained hidden for 70 years. Marcus carefully documented everything before beginning the process of carefully bringing items to the surface. The mineral concentrates alone represented a significant find, but the historical value of the documents and samples was potentially even greater. The brothers realized they weren't just mine owners. They had become custodians of a significant piece of industrial history. The ascent from the lower chamber took longer than the descent, with Marcus carefully carrying one of the smaller containers of concentrates while managing the rope system. David waited at the top of the vertical shaft, helping to secure each item as it emerged from the depths. By the end of the day, they had successfully retrieved everything from the lower chamber, transforming the back of their truck into a mobile archive of forgotten mining history. But their exploration wasn't finished. The tunnel system still had numerous unexplored passages, and the geological surveys from the crates suggested there were additional promising areas that the original miners had identified but never fully exploited. Over the following weeks, the brothers systematically explored each branch of the mine, documenting everything they found and taking samples from areas that showed potential for mineral extraction. In a passage marked on the old maps as Eastern Expansion, they discovered another chamber that contained evidence of more recent activity. Unlike the other areas of the mine that had been sealed since the 1950s, this chamber showed signs of entry from the 1970s, just before the final closure. Modern equipment lay scattered across the floor, including pneumatic drills, battery-powered lights, and even a small portable generator. Someone had attempted one final evaluation of the mine's potential in its last days of operation. That final evaluation had apparently been positive. Drill cores taken from the walls of the eastern chamber showed consistent mineralization extending deep into the surrounding rock. Notes left behind indicated that the deposits in this area alone could potentially justify reopening the mine if commodity prices were favorable and modern safety standards could be met. The evaluators had estimated millions of dollars in potential value, but their assessment had come too late to prevent the state-ordered closure. The brothers found themselves facing an unexpected situation. What had begun as a speculative real estate investment had transformed into a complex decision involving historical preservation, mineral rights, environmental concerns, and significant financial potential. The immediate value of the retrieved concentrates was substantial enough to more than cover their initial investment, but the long-term potential of the property was far greater. They consulted with experts across multiple fields, seeking advice on how to proceed responsibly. Environmental engineers evaluated the potential impact of any future mining operations. Historians expressed interest in the documents and artifacts they had discovered. Mineral economists provided analysis of current commodity markets and projections for future demand. Every consultation added another layer of complexity to their decision-making process. 6 months after their initial entry into the Blackwood mine, Marcus and David made their decision. Rather than attempting to restart mining operations, they would focus on 2 parallel tracks. First, they would work with museums and historical societies to properly preserve and display the artifacts and documents they had discovered, ensuring that the mine's history would be accessible to researchers and the public. Second, they would carefully extract and sell the mineral concentrates they had found, using those proceeds to fund proper evaluation of the mine's remaining resources. The sale of the concentrates, once properly assayed and certified, brought in just over $400,000. Combined with their initial investment and the costs of exploration, the brothers had essentially broken even on the financial side of the venture. But they had gained something more valuable. They had uncovered a piece of forgotten history, proved the value of careful research and methodical exploration, and positioned themselves as owners of a property with significant long-term potential. The historical artifacts found their way to 3 different institutions. The Smithsonian accepted several of the most significant pieces, including Thomas Blackwood's letter and a selection of the original or samples. A regional mining museum took the processing equipment and many of the hand tools, creating an exhibit about early 20th century mining techniques. The local historical society received the documents and photographs, using them to create a comprehensive archive of the mine's operations. But the story didn't end with preservation and sale. The geological data they had collected attracted attention from mining companies and investment groups interested in the property's potential. The brothers found themselves fielding offers to purchase the property, lease the mineral rights, or enter into partnership agreements that would fund proper modern extraction operations. After careful consideration, they chose to retain ownership but signed a mineral rights lease with a mid-sized mining company that specialized in reopening historic operations using modern techniques. The agreement included provisions for environmental protection, historical preservation, and profit sharing that would give the brothers a percentage of any future production without requiring them to manage the operation directly. The mining company's initial evaluation confirmed what the brothers had suspected. The Blackwood mine contained mineral deposits worth potentially tens of millions of dollars at current commodity prices. The concentrations weren't rich enough to compete with major operations, but modern extraction techniques and processing methods could make the operation profitable while meeting contemporary environmental and safety standards. 2 years after their initial purchase, preliminary work began on a new entrance to the mine, designed to meet modern safety codes while preserving the historical sections for eventual public access. The brothers watched as new equipment arrived, as engineers implemented modern support systems, and as the first new mineral samples emerged from depths that had been sealed for nearly 50 years. So here we are, at the end of this incredible journey that started with 2 brothers, a sealed mine shaft, and a whole lot of calculated risk. If this story inspired you, if it got your adrenaline pumping thinking about what might be hidden in forgotten places, then do us a favor. Smash that subscribe button and hit the notification bell so you never miss another story like this. And if you really want to support what we do here, check out our Super Thanks option and become part of our community of adventure seekers and history enthusiasts. We've got more incredible discoveries, more forgotten treasures, and more amazing stories coming your way, and we want you to be part of every single one. Drop a comment right now and let us know, would you take a risk like this? What's the most adventurous thing you've ever done? And most importantly, where are you watching from? We've got viewers all over the world, and we want to hear your stories too. Until next time, keep exploring, keep dreaming, and never stop wondering what incredible discoveries might be waiting just beneath the surface. The financial returns from the mineral rights lease began flowing within 18 months of signing the agreement. Combined with the historical value of their discovery and the publicity generated by their find, the brothers found themselves in a position they had never anticipated. They had transformed a risky investment into a sustainable income stream while contributing to historical preservation and demonstrating that with proper research, careful planning, and respect for both history and safety, forgotten places could yield remarkable discoveries. Marcus and David continued to work on real estate projects, but the Blackwood mine remained their most significant achievement. They had proved that sometimes the most valuable discoveries come not from rushing into opportunities, but from taking the time to research thoroughly, prepare carefully, and approach challenges with respect for both the past and the future. Their sealed mine shaft had indeed contained millions in value, but more importantly, it had contained a story worth telling, a piece of history worth preserving, and a lesson about the rewards that come from turning curiosity into careful action.